The rain hammered against the cathedral windows as if the sky itself was mourning the loss of Marcus Wellington. I sat in the back pew, watching my siblings occupy the front row like they owned the place, which, I supposed, they now did. Sarah dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief, her designer black dress probably costing more than most people's monthly rent. James sat rigid beside her, his jaw set in that familiar expression of superiority I'd grown to despise over the years. And then there was Michael, the golden boy, delivering the eulogy with the kind of practiced emotion that made my stomach turn. He spoke of our father's legacy, his business acumen, his devotion to family. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was family too, wasn't I? Yet here I sat, 20 rows back, feeling like a stranger at my own father's funeral. Marcus Wellington was a man who understood the value of hard work. Michael's voice carried across the cathedral. He built an empire from nothing, and he taught us that success comes to those who earn it. I almost laughed. Earn it. That was rich, coming from someone who'd been handed everything on a silver platter since birth. While my half-siblings had grown up in the mansion on Beacon Hill, I'd been raised in a modest apartment across town with my mother, seeing my father every other weekend if I was lucky. The service dragged on, filled with testimonials from business associates and family friends who barely acknowledged my existence. When it finally ended, I watched as my siblings received condolences from Boston's elite, their grief performative and perfectly timed for maximum sympathy. No one approached me. No one even seemed to notice I was there. As the crowd began to disperse, I caught sight of Harold Pemberton, my father's longtime attorney, making his way toward the front of the church. He was a thin man with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. When he spotted me, he gave a small nod of recognition. "Emma," he said quietly as he approached, "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you, Mr. Pemberton." I stood, smoothing down my simple black dress, the only appropriate funeral attire I owned. I wasn't sure if I should come. "Of course you should have come. You're his daughter." There was something in his tone that made me look at him more carefully. But before I could ask what he meant, Sarah's voice cut through the air. "Harold, there you are!" She glided over, Michael and James flanking her like bodyguards. "We need to discuss the arrangements for the reading of the will. When can we schedule it?" "Actually," Harold said, adjusting his glasses, "I was hoping to speak with all four of you together, including Emma." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sarah's perfectly composed expression cracked slightly, and James actually scoffed. "I'm sorry, what?" James stepped forward, his voice carrying that condescending tone I remembered from childhood. "Emma doesn't need to be there. She's not... she wasn't really part of the family business or anything." "Nevertheless," Harold continued firmly, "your father's will specifically requests that all four of his children be present for the reading." "That's impossible," Michael interjected. "Father would never..." "Your father was very specific about his wishes," Harold cut him off. "The reading will take place this Friday at 2 p.m. in my office. I trust you can all make it." There was a long, uncomfortable silence. I could feel the weight of my siblings' stares, the resentment radiating from them like heat from a furnace. Finally, Sarah spoke. "Of course we'll be there. But I think there's been some misunderstanding about Emma's involvement." "There's no misunderstanding," Harold said simply. "Emma, I'll see you Friday. My office address is on my card." He handed me a business card with a small smile. 2 o'clock sharp. As he walked away, leaving us standing in the church aisle, the silence stretched between us like a chasm. Finally, Michael cleared his throat. "Well, this is awkward." He turned to me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I suppose we'll see you Friday then, sister." The way he said sister made it sound like a dirty word. I watched as the three of them walked away together, their heads bent in hushed conversation. I didn't need to hear what they were saying to know they were discussing me, probably trying to figure out how to minimize whatever small token our father might have left me. As I walked to my car, a 10-year-old Honda that looked pathetic next to the luxury vehicles filling the church parking lot, I couldn't shake the feeling that Harold Pemberton knew something the rest of us didn't. The way he'd looked at me, the certainty in his voice when he insisted I be present. It was almost like he was looking forward to Friday, but that was impossible. I was the forgotten daughter, the inconvenient reminder of my father's brief affair with his secretary 28 years ago. Whatever was in that will, it certainly wasn't going to change my life, or so I thought. The days between the funeral and the will reading passed in a blur of anxiety and second-guessing. I'd taken time off from my job at the public library, a luxury I couldn't really afford, but I couldn't concentrate on cataloguing books when my mind kept wandering to what Friday might bring. My mother had been surprisingly supportive when I called to tell her about the will reading. Linda Chen had worked as my father's secretary for 3 years before their brief relationship resulted in my existence. She'd never spoken bitterly about Marcus Wellington, even when raising me alone had been a struggle. "You deserve to be there, Emma," she said over the phone, her voice gentle but firm. "You're his daughter, no matter what anyone else thinks. But what if it's just a formality? What if he left me nothing? Then at least you'll know. And if he did leave you something, you'll be there to claim it." I spent Wednesday afternoon at the local coffee shop, trying to work on my novel, a fantasy story I'd been picking at for years, but never seemed to finish. The words wouldn't come, though. Every time I tried to focus on my fictional world, my mind drifted to my father. Marcus Wellington had been an enigma to me. During my childhood visits, he'd been kind but distant, like a friendly uncle rather than a father. He'd ask about school, compliment my grades, and give me awkward hugs goodbye, but I'd never felt like I truly knew him. He had his real family, the legitimate children who lived in his house, attended his family dinners, and worked in his company. The Wellington Financial Group had been his pride and joy. He'd built it from a small accounting firm into one of Boston's most successful investment companies. Michael had been groomed to take over since he was old enough to understand what a profit margin was. Sarah worked in public relations, using her charm and connections to bring in high-profile clients. Even James, who'd initially rebelled against the family business, had eventually come around and now managed their real estate investments. And then there was me, the daughter who'd chosen English literature over business, who worked at a library instead of climbing corporate ladders, who had never shown the slightest interest in the world of finance that consumed my father's life. Thursday evening, I decided to drive past the house where I'd grown up, the modest 2-bedroom apartment my mother and I had shared until I moved out for college. It was in a decent neighborhood, but worlds away from the Wellington mansion. I remembered being 12 years old, standing in my father's study, surrounded by leather-bound books and expensive furniture, feeling like I was visiting a museum rather than my father's home. That night, I barely slept. I kept imagining different scenarios for the will reading, each one more uncomfortable than the last. In some, I was given a small token, maybe a few $1,000s, or a piece of jewelry that had belonged to my father's mother. In others, I was told that my presence had been requested only so I could be officially informed that I was receiving nothing. The worst scenario was that there had been some mistake, that Harold Pemberton had mixed up the documents, and I would be asked to leave in front of everyone. Friday morning arrived grey and drizzle, the kind of weather that seemed to match my mood. I spent an hour trying to decide what to wear, finally settling on a navy blue dress that was professional but not too formal. I didn't want to look like I was trying too hard, but I also didn't want to give my siblings any more ammunition to look down on me. The office of Pemberton and Associates was in a dignified brownstone building in the financial district. I arrived 15 minutes early and sat in the waiting room, watching the rain streak down the windows. The receptionist, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, offered me coffee and made small talk about the weather. At exactly 2 p.m., Harold Pemberton emerged from his office. He was dressed in a crisp grey suit, his silver hair neatly combed, and he carried himself with the kind of quiet authority that comes from decades of handling sensitive family matters. "Emma, thank you for coming. Are you ready?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure I'd ever be ready for whatever was coming. The conference room was elegant, but not ostentatious, with a long mahogany table and high-backed leather chairs. My siblings were already seated, Michael at the head of the table, as if he were already running the family business, Sarah to his right and James to his left. They looked up as I entered, their expressions ranging from mild annoyance to barely concealed hostility. "Emma," Sarah said with a tight smile, "how nice that you could make it." I took the seat across from her, trying to ignore the way James was drumming his fingers impatiently on the table. Michael was checking his phone, as if he had more important things to do than listen to our father's final wishes. Harold took his place at the opposite head of the table and opened a thick folder. "Before we begin, I want to thank you all for being here. I know this is a difficult time, and I appreciate your patience with this process." "Let's just get on with it," James muttered. "Some of us have actual work to do." Harold's expression didn't change, but I caught a flicker of something disapproval in his eyes. "Very well. Let me start by reading the opening statement of your father's last will and testament." He cleared his throat and began to read in his careful, measured voice. The legal language was dense and formal, but the meaning was clear enough. My father had been of sound mind when he wrote the will. He acknowledged his 4 children, and he was distributing his estate according to his wishes. Then came the part I'd been dreading. "To my daughter Sarah Wellington Ashford," Harold read, "I leave my property at 47 Marlborough Street, along with all furnishings and contents, valued at approximately $2.8 million. Sarah's face lit up with a smile that was equal parts triumph and relief. The Marlborough Street property was a beautiful townhouse in the heart of Back Bay, the kind of place that appeared in architectural magazines. To my son James Wellington, I leave my portfolio of commercial real estate properties, valued at approximately $4.2 million, as well as my collection of vintage automobiles." James actually smiled, the first genuine expression I'd seen from him all day. My father's car collection was legendary among his friends, featuring everything from a 1965 Mustang to a 2018 Ferrari. To my son Michael Wellington, I leave controlling interest in Wellington Financial Group, including all assets, accounts and business interests, valued at approximately $15.7 million. Michael's smile was more subdued, but I could see the satisfaction in his eyes. He'd been expecting this, had probably been preparing for it his entire life. The room fell silent. Harold turned the page and I braced myself for whatever small consolation prize was coming my way. Maybe a few $1,000s, maybe some books from my father's library, maybe nothing at all. And to my daughter Emma Wellington Chen, I held my breath. I leave the remainder of my estate. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the rain pattering against the windows. I blinked, certain I'd misheard. "I'm sorry," Michael said slowly. "Could you repeat that?" Harold looked up from the document, his expression carefully neutral. "To Emma Wellington Chen, I leave the remainder of my estate, including all liquid assets, investment portfolios, and any property not specifically designated to other beneficiaries." "That's impossible," Sarah said, her voice rising. "There must be some mistake." "I assure you there's no mistake," Harold replied calmly. "However, there is more. Your father included a final clause that explains his reasoning. Would you like me to continue?" I felt like I was in a dream. The remainder of the estate? What did that even mean? And why was Harold looking at me with what almost seemed like pride? "Yes," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "Please continue." Harold turned to the final page of the document, and I noticed his hands were completely steady. Whatever was coming, he'd been prepared for this moment. "The final clause," he said, "is addressed to all 4 of you." Harold adjusted his glasses and looked around the table, his gaze settling on each of us in turn. The tension in the room was so thick I could almost taste it. Sarah's face had gone pale. Michael's jaw was clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might crack, and James looked like he was about to flip the table. "Your father asked me to read this final section in his own words," Harold said, his voice gentle but firm. "He wrote it himself in longhand, just 3 months before his death. He cleared his throat and began to read. To my children, all 4 of my children, I know this will come as a shock. I know that Sarah, Michael, and James are expecting to inherit the bulk of my estate, just as I know that Emma is expecting very little, if anything at all. I've spent the last months of my life thinking about legacy, about what it means to be a father, and about the mistakes I've made. I have failed Emma in ways that I can never undo. I allowed my guilt and fear to keep me at a distance from my youngest daughter, and in doing so, I robbed her of the father she deserved and robbed myself of the chance to truly know the remarkable woman she has become. Sarah, Michael, and James, you have been given every advantage in life. You have been raised in luxury, educated at the finest schools, and handed opportunities that most people can only dream of. You have been loved and supported and encouraged at every turn. You have never known what it means to struggle, to work for something you weren't sure you could achieve, or to persevere in the face of indifference. Emma has known all of these things. She has worked her way through college. She has built her own life without my help or my money, and she has done so with grace and dignity. She has never asked me for anything, never demanded recognition or financial support, never used our relationship for personal gain. She has earned her place in this world through her own efforts, and that is something that cannot be taught or bought. I am leaving the majority of my estate to Emma, not to punish my other children, but to balance the scales of a lifetime of inequality. Sarah, Michael, and James will inherit enough to ensure their comfort and security, but they will also inherit something else, the opportunity to discover what they are truly capable of when they must rely on themselves rather than on their father's wealth. Emma, my dear daughter, I hope you will use this inheritance wisely. I hope you will see it not as a burden, but as the freedom to pursue your dreams without the constraints of financial worry. I hope you will forgive an old man for waiting too long to right the wrongs of the past. To all of my children, I hope you will find a way to support each other in the years to come. You are family, and family is the only thing that truly matters in the end. With love and hope for your futures, Marcus Wellington. The silence that followed was deafening. I stared at Harold, my mind reeling, unable to process what I'd just heard. My father he'd actually... How much? Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. Harold consulted his papers. The liquid assets, investment portfolios, and remaining properties total approximately $23.7 million. I felt the blood drain from my face. $23.7 million. It was more money than I could even conceptualize. I'd been worried about making rent next month, and now... This is insane, James exploded, jumping to his feet. He can't do this. There has to be some way to contest it. He was sick. He wasn't thinking clearly. Your father was examined by 2 independent physicians in the weeks before he signed this will, Harold interrupted calmly. Both confirmed that he was of sound mind and body. The will is ironclad. Michael's voice was deadly quiet when he spoke. You knew, didn't you? You knew this whole time what was in the will. Harold nodded. I helped your father draft it. I also tried to convince him to discuss his intentions with all of you before his death, but he was adamant that the reading of the will should be the first time you learned of his decision. Because he knew we'd fight it, Sarah said bitterly. He knew we'd try to talk him out of it. Perhaps, Harold agreed, but his reasoning was sound. He felt that advanced knowledge would only create conflict and resentment within the family. He hoped that by explaining his reasoning, you might understand his perspective. His perspective, James's voice was rising again. His perspective is that we're spoiled brats who don't deserve our inheritance, while his bastard daughter... James! Sarah snapped, but the damage was done. The word hung in the air between us like a slap. I'd been called worse things in my life, but hearing it from my half-brother in this moment, with Harold sitting right there, made my cheeks burn with shame and anger. I think, Harold said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade, that we should take a break. This is a lot to process, and emotions are running high. No, I said. surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. I want to hear what they have to say. I want to understand what they're thinking. Michael leaned back in his chair, studying me with calculating eyes. What we're thinking, Emma, is that this is impossible. You can't seriously expect us to just accept this. You barely knew him. You weren't part of his life. You weren't part of the business. Because I wasn't allowed to be, I interrupted. Because every time I tried to get closer to him, I was made to feel like an outsider, like I didn't belong. You didn't belong, Sarah said coldly. Not really. You were the result of a mistake, a brief affair that ended before you were even born. We're his real children, his legitimate family. Sarah, Harold said warningly, but she ignored him. She doesn't understand what it means to carry on the Wellington name, to maintain the family business, to uphold the traditions and values that our father built his life around. She's a librarian, for God's sake. What is she going to do with $23 million? Maybe, I said quietly, I'll figure it out as I go, just like I've figured out everything else in my life. The room fell silent again. I could see the wheels turning in my siblings' minds, could practically hear them calculating their options. Finally, Michael spoke. We'll contest it. We'll find a way to prove he wasn't competent when he signed it, or that you influenced him somehow. How? I asked. I saw him maybe 6 times in the last 5 years. How exactly did I influence him? There are ways, James said darkly. There are always ways. Harold cleared his throat. I should mention that your father anticipated this possibility. He's included a clause stating that any attempt to contest the will by his other children will result in their inheritances being revoked and donated to charity. The color drained from Michael's face. He wouldn't. He would, and he did. The clause is very specific. Any legal challenge to Emma's inheritance will trigger the forfeiture of your own bequests. Another silence fell over the room, this one even more oppressive than the last. I could feel the hatred radiating from my siblings, could see the way they were looking at me, not as a sister, but as an enemy who had stolen something that belonged to them. I think, Harold said gently, that we should adjourn for today. Emma, I'll need to schedule some time with you next week to go over the details of your inheritance. There are quite a few moving parts to manage. Wait, I said, looking around the table at my siblings. Before we go, I want you to know that I didn't ask for this. I didn't expect it, and I certainly didn't scheme for it. I'm as shocked as you are. Are you? Sarah asked, her voice dripping with skepticism. Are you really? Yes, I said firmly. I am. And I want you to know that I'm not your enemy. We're family, and maybe we can find a way to work through this together. Michael's laugh was bitter. Work through it. Emma, you just inherited $23 million that should have been divided among the 4 of us. You essentially stole $20 million from your own siblings. You think we're going to work through that? I didn't steal anything, I said, my voice rising. I didn't even know about it until 5 minutes ago. But you're going to keep it, aren't you? James asked. You're going to take the money and run, just like your mother did when she got pregnant and... Stop. Harold's voice cut through the air like a whip. That's enough, all of you. This is exactly the kind of behavior your father was hoping to avoid. But it was too late. The damage was done, the lines drawn. As I gathered my purse and prepared to leave, I could feel the weight of my siblings' stares, could sense the anger and resentment that would probably last for the rest of our lives. As I reached the door, I turned back one last time. For what it's worth, I said, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that this happened this way, and I'm sorry that our father felt he had to choose between us. But I'm not sorry that he finally acknowledged me as his daughter. With that, I walked out of the conference room and into the hallway, leaving behind 3 people who had once been my family and were now my enemies. But as I stood in the elevator, watching the numbers light up as I descended to the lobby, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The will reading was over, but the real battle was about to begin. The media attention started the next morning. I woke up to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. My phone had been buzzing all night, but I'd turned it off after the first few calls from numbers I didn't recognize. When I finally checked it over my morning coffee, I realized my quiet life had officially ended. "Wellington heiress emerges from shadows," read the headline in the Boston Globe. Below it was a photograph of me leaving Harold's office building, looking shell-shocked and disheveled. I didn't even remember anyone taking the picture. The article was surprisingly thorough, considering how quickly it had been written. Someone had done their homework, digging up details about my mother's employment at Wellington Financial, my academic achievements, and even my job at the library. The tone was sympathetic but sensational, painting me as the long-lost daughter who had finally come into her inheritance. My phone rang again. This time it was my mother. "Emma, sweetheart, are you all right? I've been trying to reach you all morning." "I'm fine, Mom. Just processing." I saw the news. $23 million? Her voice was filled with wonder and concern in equal measure. "Honey, do you understand what this means?" "It means my life just got a lot more complicated." That was an understatement. By noon, there were reporters camped outside my apartment building. I watched from my window as they set up their equipment, their cameras pointed at my front door like weapons. My neighbors were starting to stare, and I could see Mrs. Patterson from 2B talking animatedly to a woman with a microphone. I called in sick to work, knowing that the library would be swarmed with reporters if I showed up. My supervisor, Janet, was understanding but concerned. "Emma, are you sure you're all right? The whole staff is talking about the news." We had 3 different news stations call asking for comments. "I'm fine. I just need a few days to figure things out. Take all the time you need. And Emma, congratulations, I think. Is it appropriate to congratulate someone on inheriting millions of dollars?" I laughed for the first time since leaving Harold's office. "I honestly don't know." Around 2 o'clock, Harold called. "Emma, I'm sorry to bother you, but we need to talk. The media attention is more intense than I anticipated, and there are some time-sensitive matters we need to address. I can't leave my apartment. There are reporters everywhere. I understand. Would you be comfortable if I came to you? I can use the building's service entrance to avoid the crowd." An hour later, Harold was sitting in my tiny living room, looking oddly formal among my second-hand furniture and overflowing bookshelves. He'd brought a thick folder of documents and a thermos of coffee. "First things first," he said, settling into my worn armchair. "We need to talk about security. Your inheritance makes you a target, not just for media attention, but for people with less pleasant intentions." The thought hadn't occurred to me. "You mean like kidnapping?" "Among other things, I've taken the liberty of contacting a security firm that specializes in protecting high-net-worth individuals. They're discreet and professional, and I think you should consider their services, at least temporarily." "Harold, I can't afford private security. I mean, I know I'm supposedly rich now, but I don't actually have access to any of that money yet, right?" "Actually, you do. One of the benefits of your father's estate planning is that the transition of liquid assets can happen relatively quickly. I've already begun the process of transferring your inheritance to accounts in your name. You should have access to at least a portion of it by early next week." The reality of it hit me like a physical blow. In a matter of days, I would go from worrying about my credit card balance to having more money than I could spend in a lifetime. "There's something else we need to discuss," Harold continued. "Your siblings. What about them?" "They've been active. Michael called me this morning asking about the specifics of the contest clause. Sarah's been reaching out to other lawyers, trying to find someone willing to challenge the will despite the financial risks. And James, what about James? James has been talking to reporters. Off the record, of course, but he's been painting a picture of you as a manipulative outsider who somehow convinced your father to change his will." I felt a surge of anger. "That's ridiculous. I barely spoke to my father in the last 5 years. I know that, and you know that, but public perception can be a powerful thing. We need to be prepared for the narrative that's going to emerge." "What narrative?" Harold leaned forward, his expression serious. "The narrative that you're not the rightful heir. That you're somehow illegitimate, not just legally, but morally. That you don't deserve the Wellington name or the Wellington fortune. But I am legitimate. My father acknowledged me in his will. He explained his reasoning. Yes, but that's not the story that's going to sell newspapers or get clicks online. The story that will sell is the one about the 3 real children being cheated out of their inheritance by the outsider daughter. I sank back into my couch, feeling overwhelmed. So what do I do? You have a few options. You could try to stay out of the public eye, let the story die down naturally. That might work, but it also leaves you vulnerable to controlling the narrative. Or you could take control of the story yourself. Tell your side of things, explain who you are, why your father made this decision, what you plan to do with the inheritance. I don't know what I plan to do with it. Then maybe it's time to figure that out. That evening, after Harold left, I sat in my kitchen with a legal pad and tried to make sense of my new reality. $23 million. The number was so large it felt abstract, like a figure from a math problem rather than something real. I thought about my father's letter, about his words regarding the mistakes he'd made and the opportunities he'd missed. I thought about my mother, working 2 jobs to put me through college, never once complaining about the financial burden. I thought about my siblings, who had grown up with every advantage and now saw me as a thief. My phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number, but something made me answer. Emma. The voice was familiar, but I couldn't place it immediately. Yes? It's David. David Morrison. We went to college together. David. I remembered him now. Tall, serious, studying journalism while I was buried in English literature. We dated briefly junior year, nothing serious, but we'd remained friends. David. Hi. How did you get this number? I'm a reporter now, Emma. I work for the Globe. I'm the one who wrote the article about your inheritance. I felt a chill run down my spine. You wrote that article? Yes, and I'm calling because I want to give you a chance to tell your side of the story. I think you're getting railroaded by your siblings, and I'd like to help you set the record straight. I don't know, David. I'm not sure I want to talk to any reporters right now. I understand. But Emma, your siblings are already talking. They're painting you as the villain in this story, and if you don't speak up, their version is going to be the only one people hear. I thought about what Harold had said about controlling the narrative. What kind of story would you want to write? An honest one, about what it was like growing up as Marcus Wellington's forgotten daughter, about how you built your own life without his help, about what you really plan to do with this inheritance. I don't know what I plan to do with it. Then we'll figure it out together. Emma, I know this is overwhelming, but you have an opportunity here, not just to defend yourself, but to show people who you really are. I found myself thinking about my father's words, about how he'd wanted to give me the freedom to pursue my dreams without financial constraints. Maybe talking to David was the first step in figuring out what those dreams actually were. Okay, I said finally. Let's talk. As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced since walking out of Harold's office, a sense of possibility. Yes, my life had been turned upside down. Yes, my relationship with my siblings was probably ruined forever. But maybe, just maybe, this was my chance to become the person I'd always wanted to be, the person my father had believed I could become. The interview with David took place 3 days later in a small cafe in Cambridge, far from the media circus surrounding my apartment. I'd taken Harold's advice and hired the security firm, 2 discreet professionals who made sure I wasn't followed and kept the overeager reporters at bay. David looked older than I remembered, more serious, with the kind of focused intensity that came from years of chasing stories. But his smile was the same, warm and genuine, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe normally. You look like you haven't slept in a week, he said, as we settled into a corner booth. I haven't. Not really. I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup, grateful for the warmth. David, before we start, I need to know something. Are you doing this because you care about the truth or because it's a good story? Both, he said honestly. I won't lie to you, Emma. This is a hell of a story, and it's going to advance my career. But I also remember you from college. You were one of the most genuine people I knew, and watching your siblings tear you apart in the media is making me sick. What are they saying? David pulled out his tablet and scrolled through several articles. Here's a quote from Michael. Emma was never really part of our family. She had minimal contact with our father and no involvement in the family business. We're shocked that she's chosen to accept an inheritance that rightfully belongs to his legitimate children. The word stung, even though I'd been expecting them. Legitimate children. Yeah, that's a nice touch. Sarah's been more subtle, but no less damaging. She's been talking about your father's declining mental state in his final months, suggesting that he was vulnerable to manipulation. Manipulation by whom? I barely saw him. That's what I want to help you prove. But first I need you to tell me your story. All of it, starting from the beginning. For the next 2 hours, I told David everything. About growing up knowing I had a father who lived across town, but feeling like he existed in a different world. About the awkward weekend visits, the birthday cards with checks but no personal messages, the way I'd always felt like I was auditioning for his love rather than simply receiving it. I told him about my mother, about how she'd worked 2 jobs to put me through college, never once bad-mouthing my father, despite the way he'd treated both of us. I talked about the Christmas invitations that never came, the family photos I was never part of, the way my siblings had always made it clear that I was an outsider. The thing is, I said, stirring my 3rd cup of coffee, I don't think my father was trying to be cruel. I think he was just compartmentalized. He had his real family, his public family, and then he had me, and I think he genuinely didn't know how to bridge that gap. David nodded, taking notes. When was the last time you spoke to him? About 6 months before he died. He called me out of the blue, which was unusual. Usually our conversations were scheduled through his assistant, but this time he just called. What did you talk about? I closed my eyes, remembering. He asked about my writing. I'd mentioned years ago that I was working on a novel, and he actually remembered. He wanted to know if I'd finished it, if I was planning to publish it. I was so surprised that he'd remembered, I could barely put together a coherent response. What else? He told me he was proud of me for building my own life, for not asking him for help, for becoming independent. I thought it was strange at the time, but now I trailed off, realizing the significance. Now you think he was already planning the will change? Maybe. I don't know. But David, I want you to understand something. I never asked him for anything. I never tried to manipulate him or convince him to leave me money. I didn't even know he was sick until I read about it in the obituaries. David's expression grew serious. Emma, there's something I need to tell you. I've been doing some research into your siblings' finances, and there are some things you should know. What kind of things? Michael's been making some risky investments with the company's money. Nothing illegal, but the business isn't as solid as it appears on paper. Sarah's husband has been having some financial troubles. His real estate development company is leveraged to the hilt, and James... What about James? James has a gambling problem. He owes money to some very unpleasant people. I stared at him. How do you know all this? Because I'm a good reporter, and because your father's death has created a lot of interest in the Wellington family finances. Emma, I think your siblings need this inheritance more than they're letting on, and I think your father knew that. What do you mean? I mean, maybe he changed his will not just to make things fair for you, but to protect the family assets from his other children's poor decisions. Maybe he figured that if he left the bulk of the estate to you, at least it would be safe. The idea had never occurred to me, but it made a strange kind of sense. My father had always been a shrewd businessman, always thinking 3 steps ahead. What if the will wasn't just about making amends? What if it was about preserving his legacy? There's something else, David continued. I've been in touch with some of your father's former business associates, people who knew him well. They all say the same thing. Marcus Wellington was sharp as a tack right up until the end. There's no way he was mentally compromised when he changed his will. So my siblings' claims about his mental state, are complete bullshit. Excuse my language, but that's what they are. Your father knew exactly what he was doing, and he had very good reasons for doing it. After the interview, David walked me to where my security detail was waiting. Emma, I want you to know that I'm going to write a fair article. I'm going to tell your story, but I'm also going to verify everything. If there's anything you haven't told me, anything that might come out later and make you look bad, you need to tell me now. There's nothing, I said. I've told you everything. Good. Because once this article comes out, your siblings are going to come after you with everything they've got. You need to be prepared for that. The article ran the following Sunday with the headline, "The Forgotten Daughter, Inside Emma Wellington's Journey from Outsider to Heiress." It was everything David had promised. Fair, thorough and sympathetic without being sentimental. He'd done his homework, interviewing former classmates, colleagues from the library, even some of my father's business associates. The response was immediate and intense. By Monday morning, public opinion had shifted dramatically. Social media was full of supportive messages, calling me brave for speaking out and criticizing my siblings for their treatment of me. The tide of public sympathy had turned, and it was flowing in my direction. My siblings, predictably, were furious. Michael held a press conference outside the Wellington Financial Group offices, flanked by Sarah and James. He looked polished and professional, but I could see the anger simmering beneath the surface. My siblings and I are disappointed by the false and misleading statements that have been published about our family, he said, reading from a prepared statement. Emma Wellington has chosen to air private family matters in the press, rather than working with us to resolve this situation amicably. We remain committed to honoring our father's true wishes and protecting his legacy. Sarah stepped forward next. Our father was a private man who valued discretion and family unity above all else. Emma's decision to involve the media in what should be a private family matter is exactly the kind of behavior that shows why she was never truly part of our family. But it was James who delivered the most damaging blow. "What Emma hasn't told the public," he said, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage, "is that she contacted our father repeatedly in his final months, calling his private line and even showing up at his office unannounced. She knew he was sick, she knew he was vulnerable, and she took advantage of that vulnerability to manipulate him into changing his will." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. It was completely false. I hadn't contacted my father at all in his final months, except for that one phone call he'd made to me, but I could see how effective it was. Doubt flickered across the faces of the reporters, and I knew that James had just planted a seed that would be very difficult to uproot. That evening, Harold called me. "Emma, we need to talk. James's accusations are serious, and we need to address them immediately." "But they're not true. I never tried to contact my father. I never manipulated him." "I know that, and I can prove it. Your father kept detailed records of all his communications, including phone logs and appointment schedules. I have documentation showing that you had no contact with him in his final 6 months, except for that one call he made to you." "Then why don't we release that information?" "Because it's privileged attorney-client information, and releasing it would require your permission as his heir. Are you prepared to make your father's private communications public?" I thought about it. Making the records public would clear my name, but it would also expose my father's private thoughts and conversations in his final months. It felt like a violation of his privacy, even though he was gone. "What do you think I should do?" "I think," Harold said carefully, "that you should consider the possibility that your siblings are going to keep escalating this fight until one of you backs down, and I don't think they're planning to be the ones who back down." "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe it's time to consider a compromise. Maybe there's a way to resolve this that doesn't require destroying your family completely." "What kind of compromise?" "We'll discuss it tomorrow. But Emma, I want you to think about something. Your father left you this inheritance because he believed you would use it wisely. Part of using it wisely might be finding a way to heal the wounds in your family rather than deepening them. After Harold hung up, I stood in my apartment looking out at the city lights, thinking about family and forgiveness, and the price of being right. My father had wanted to balance the scales, to give me the opportunities I'd been denied. But maybe he'd also hoped that his children would find a way to come together, to support each other despite their differences. The question was it too late for that? Or was there still a chance to be the bigger person, to find a way forward that honored both my father's wishes and the complicated reality of family? I didn't have an answer yet. But I knew that whatever decision I made would define not just my future, but the kind of person I would become with this unexpected gift my father had given me. The kind of person he had believed I could be. The compromise meeting took place on a Thursday morning in Harold's conference room, the same space where everything had started 3 weeks earlier. But the atmosphere was completely different now. Where there had once been shock and confusion, there was now a cold, calculated tension that made the air feel electric. My siblings arrived together, as they had for the will reading, but now they were accompanied by their own lawyer, a sharp-faced woman named Patricia Blackwood, who had a reputation for winning ugly custody battles and bitter divorce settlements. She looked like someone who enjoyed conflict, who thrived on it. I came alone except for Harold, a decision that I hoped would signal my willingness to find a peaceful resolution. But as I watched Patricia arrange her files with military precision, I wondered if I'd made a mistake. "Before we begin," Patricia said, not bothering with pleasantries, "I want to make it clear that my clients are here as a courtesy. They have no legal obligation to negotiate with Ms. Chen, and they are under no illusion that she has any moral right to the inheritance she's claimed. Miss Chen is Marcus Wellington's daughter and his legal heir," Harold replied calmly. "She has every right, both legal and moral, to the inheritance her father chose to leave her. An inheritance obtained through manipulation and undue influence of a sick, elderly man. An inheritance explained in detail in Mr. Wellington's own words, written when he was of completely sound mind and body. I could see this was going to deteriorate quickly. "Please," I said, speaking for the first time since we'd sat down, "can we just talk? Like family?" "We're not family," Sarah said coldly. "Not really. Family doesn't steal from each other." "I didn't steal anything, didn't you?" Michael leaned forward, his voice deceptively calm. "You inherited $23 million that should have been divided among 4 people. By any reasonable calculation, you took roughly $20 million that didn't belong to you. It belonged to me because my father chose to give it to me." "Your father was dying," James said. "He was scared and vulnerable, and you took advantage of that." "How? I barely spoke to him in his final year. How exactly did I take advantage of him?" Patricia cleared her throat. "My clients are prepared to make a generous offer. They're willing to give you $5 million from the estate, no questions asked, no further legal challenges. In return, you would renounce your claim to the remainder of the inheritance. $5 million. I tried to process the number. It was more money than I could ever spend, more than enough to secure my future. But it was also less than a quarter of what my father had left me. "It's more than generous," Sarah added. "It's more than you ever would have expected before the will reading. But it's not what my father wanted." "Your father," Michael said, his composure finally cracking, "was out of his mind. He gave away our family's legacy, our birthright, to someone who was never really part of the family. You think that's what he really wanted? You think he really wanted to destroy everything he built?" "Maybe he wanted to make it stronger," I said quietly. "Maybe he thought giving me a stake in the family would finally make me a real part of it." "There is no real part," James snapped. "You're the daughter of a secretary he had an affair with. You're not a Wellington. You're a mistake." The words hung in the air like poison. I felt Harold tense beside me, saw Patricia shoot James a warning look. Even my siblings seemed to realize he'd gone too far. But in that moment, something crystallized for me. I thought about my father's letter, about his regrets and his hopes for the future. I thought about my mother, working 2 jobs to give me opportunities. I thought about all the years I'd spent feeling like I wasn't good enough, like I didn't deserve to be acknowledged or loved or included. "You're right," I said, standing up. "I'm not a Wellington." I could see the surprise on their faces, the beginning of what they probably thought was victory. "I'm a Chen. I'm my mother's daughter, and she taught me that family isn't about blood or names or money. It's about love and support and being there for each other when it matters." I looked around the table, meeting each of their eyes in turn. My father left me that inheritance because he realized too late that he'd failed me as a father. He was trying to make amends for 28 years of treating me like a shameful secret. And you know what? I'm going to honor his wishes, not because I want to hurt you, but because I finally understand what he was trying to tell me. "Emma," Harold said quietly, "you don't have to make this decision right now." "Yes, I do." I turned back to my siblings. "I'm keeping the inheritance, all of it, and I'm going to use it to build something better than what our father left behind." Patricia's smile was predatory. "I hope you're prepared for a very long, very public legal battle. My clients have substantial resources and the moral high ground." "No," I said, surprising them all. "They don't." I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder Harold had given me the night before, copies of the documentation he'd mentioned, the phone logs and appointment records that proved I'd had no contact with my father in his final months. "Harold," I looked at my father's old lawyer, who had become something like a protector to me. "I'm waiving attorney-client privilege. I want these records made public." Harold's eyebrows rose. "Emma, are you sure? Once this information is released, there's no taking it back." "I'm sure." I turned back to my siblings, who were looking increasingly uncomfortable as Patricia rifled through the documents. "These records prove that I had no inappropriate contact with our father. They show that he called me, not the other way around. They document every interaction we had, and they demonstrate clearly that there was no manipulation, no undue influence, no coercion of any kind." "No, these could be fabricated," James said, but his voice lacked conviction. "They're official phone company records and appointment logs from your father's office, witnessed and signed by his assistant," Harold said. "They're absolutely authentic, and they completely exonerate Emma of any wrongdoing." The room fell silent. I could see the calculation happening in my siblings' eyes, the realization that their legal challenge had just become much more difficult. "There's something else," I continued. "I've done some research of my own over the past few weeks. Michael, I know about the risky investments you've been making with company funds. Sarah, I know about Richard's development company and the debt you're carrying. James, I know about the gambling debts and the people you owe money to." The color drained from their faces. "I think our father knew about these things too. I think he changed his will not just to help me, but to protect the family assets from your poor decisions. He was trying to preserve his legacy, not destroy it." "You can't prove any of that," Patricia said, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "Maybe not, but I can certainly make it public knowledge. I can hold my own press conference, release these documents, and tell the world exactly what kind of financial trouble the legitimate Wellington children have gotten themselves into." "You wouldn't," Sarah whispered. "I would, but I don't want to." I sat back down, leaning forward across the table. "I have a different proposal." They waited, and I could see that for the first time since this whole mess began, I had their complete attention. "I keep the inheritance as our father intended, but I also establish a trust fund for each of you, enough to cover your debts and provide you with a comfortable living, but not enough to enable the kind of reckless behavior that got you into trouble in the first place." "How much?" Michael asked quietly. $2 million each, paid out over 10 years. It's enough to solve your immediate problems and provide financial security, but it comes with conditions." "What conditions?" "Michael, you step down as CEO of Wellington Financial and bring in professional management. The company gets restructured to eliminate the risky investments and focus on stable, long-term growth. Sarah, you and Richard get financial counseling and agree to debt consolidation. James, you enter a gambling addiction treatment program and agree to ongoing therapy. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. "And if we refuse?" Patricia asked. "Then I keep everything as our father intended, and you get nothing beyond what's already been allocated in the will. Plus, I make all of your financial troubles public knowledge." "You're blackmailing us," James said. "No," I replied. "I'm offering you a second chance, just like our father offered me." Michael was the first to speak. "The trust funds, they would be irrevocable." "Yes, once established, I couldn't change the terms or take the money back, even if I wanted to." "And you would really follow through on making our problems public if we refuse?" "I would. I've learned a lot about dealing with the media in the past few weeks, and I'm not the same person who walked into this room 3 weeks ago." They huddled with Patricia for several minutes, speaking in hushed voices. I could see the debate playing out on their faces, pride warring with practicality, resentment fighting with financial necessity. Finally, they returned to their seats. "We need time to consider your offer," Sarah said. "You have until tomorrow at 5 p.m., I replied. "After that, the offer expires." As we gathered our things to leave, Michael stopped me at the door. "Emma," he said quietly, so the others couldn't hear. "Why are you doing this? Why offer us anything at all?" I thought about it for a moment, because despite everything that's happened, despite all the cruel things that have been said, you're still my family. And because I think our father would have wanted us to find a way to support each other. And if we take your offer, what then? Do we all just pretend to be one big happy family? "No," I said honestly. "I don't think we'll ever be that. But maybe we can find a way to coexist without destroying each other. Maybe we can build something new from the ashes of what we've lost." Michael nodded slowly. "I'll talk to the others." The next evening, Harold called me with their answer. They had accepted my proposal. As I hung up the phone, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. I had won, in a sense, but victory felt hollow when it came at the cost of family relationships that might never be repaired. But I had also done something my father would have been proud of. I had found a way to honor his wishes while also showing mercy to the siblings who had treated me as an enemy. I had chosen forgiveness over revenge, healing over hatred. It wasn't the ending any of us had expected, but maybe it was the ending we all needed. And maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something better. 6 months later, I published my first novel, a story about family, forgiveness, and finding your place in the world. I dedicated it to my father, Marcus Wellington, and to my mother, Linda Chen, who taught me that sometimes the greatest strength lies in knowing when to fight and when to forgive. The Wellington Financial Group, under new professional management, began to recover from its earlier missteps. Sarah and Richard successfully consolidated their debts and started rebuilding their financial stability. James completed his treatment program and, with the support of ongoing therapy, began to rebuild his relationship with his family. Michael and I still rarely speak, but we've developed a grudging respect for each other. He once told a reporter that I had turned out to be more of a Wellington than any of us expected. I took that as a compliment. As for me, I'm still figuring out what to do with the rest of my life. But for the first time, I'm doing it without the weight of financial worry, without the burden of feeling like I don't belong anywhere, and without the need to prove my worth to anyone but myself. My father was right. The inheritance wasn't just money. It was freedom, and I intend to use it wisely.